101,017 by Hooshang Amirahmadi, Ph.D. Professor, Rutgers University. Iranian Americans support diplomacy with Iran. The jcpoa from despair to hope. The North Korean crisis has pushed the future of the 2015 nuclear deal among Iran and the 51 U.S., UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, commonly referred to as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA) into the background. Yet, this temporary situation will soon reverse itself as a powerful storm is gathering around the subject. The JCPOA, which was intended to reduce tension between the U.S. and Iran, has been criticized repeatedly by President Donald Trump as a highly deficient agreement, and this change in the White House's attitude under a new president is the primary cause of this developing storm. Indeed, US-Iran relations have unexpectedly become highly explosive in the post-jcpoa period. President Donald Trump's speech at the UN was a clear indication of this new situation. To mitigate this emerging danger, the policy community must overcome complacency, act with urgency, offer an even-handed and realistic analysis, and propose a fair solution. President Trump has said that the deal is bad and that the JCPOA and all its underlying tenets and documents must be strengthened through renegotiation. Otherwise, he has threatened to scrape the deal or demand significant modifications to it. To Trump's pleasure, and Iran's dismay, the French President Emmanuel Macron, who wishes to maintain the JCPOA, his country has already made significant inroads into the Iranian economy, supports the idea of strengthening the JCPOA by extending its sunset timeline, and introducing new requirements for controlling Iran's missile program and regional influence. Conservatives in the U.S. have even charged that the former President Barack Obama concluded the deal largely to create a legacy for himself rather than protect the U.S. national interest. Just like many other signature accomplishments of Mr. Obama, President Trump's ideal will be to overturn this one as well. On the opposite side, Iran has argued that the JCPOA is a multilateral agreement that has been ratified unanimously by the UN Security Council, and is essential for the preservation of peace, and must be thus preserved. Tehran is nervous about a possible negative action by Mr. Trump because it has made the JCPOA a source of national pride, and has depended on the deal to rebuild its economy. Tehran's expectation is that Mr. Trump will challenge Iran's compliance, send the deal to the U.S. Congress, and reimpose sanctions that were lifted. It is no wonder that Iran is making every effort to convince other parties to the JCPOA to continue honoring the deal. However, leaders in the Islamic Republic have made confusing statements about what they might do in reaction to Trump's scraping of the deal. Tehran has publicly objected to renegotiation the deal, but it might be convinced to renegotiate if its terms can be well established in advance. Iran fears that renegotiating the deal will open a Pandora's box of renewed pressure and more unacceptable concessions. To save the JCPOA, President Hassan Rouhani government is hoping to convince Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's leader, to accede to an extension of the sunset clause beyond 2025 and allow limited monitoring of its military sites. Concession on missiles will not be possible now, but even that might be open for negotiations if some of Iran's security and economic demands are met. Tehran will also be most concerned with the publicity of such concessions, as they could lead to opposition by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps (IRGC) and political upheavals by the Islamic hardliners and patriotic Iranians. Notwithstanding these concerns by Tehran, President Trump is adamant that the deal be openly renegotiated and its defects fully corrected. Indeed, Mr. Trump and associates want to make the JCPOA a permanent deal or scrap it, and see Iran's missile power diminished and its military sites open to intrusive monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA). The organization is tasked to ensure that Iran is complying with its technical commitments in the JCPOA. Contrary to the publicly held view, Trump is unlikely to scrap the JCPOA initially. Rather, he will maintain it as a killing trap for Iran by tough sanctions and military threats. The purpose of this coercive process will be to force Tehran to accede to Trump's demands, weaken Iran, and ultimately change its theocratic regime, which Trump derided harshly during his address to the UN General Assembly. In this essay, I will discuss current U.S. concerns with the JCPOA, including the deal's sunset clause, and Iran's missiles, as well as what it sees as the broader issue of Iran's regional misdeeds. I will also describe Iran's rebuttal, but show that Washington will not be convinced and that Trump is expected to persist in his demands. Mr. Trump might even append the push for renegotiation of the JCPOA with a policy of regime change if Tehran continues its current policies and regional posture. I will also outline some of the key measures, including crippling new sanctions, that the U.S. might introduce to make Iran accept a new nuclear deal or exit the JCPOA. Iran's possible countermeasures will also be discussed. While Trump's coercive measures will not be immediately effective, Tehran may find it hard to persist if Europeans join the U.S., which is likely given that some of the U.S. concerns are also echoed by France, Germany and the U.K. Yet, as I will argue, and the jcpoa experience indicates, a resolution that is based on coercive measures will not be in the long-term interest of either side and cannot be sustained. A more amicable resolution will require that both parties consider realities on the ground and accept a paradigm shift in the way each sees the other. I will outline some of such realities and explain areas where serious rethinking has become imperative. The concluding section will speculate about the likelihood of a comprehensive settlement. U.S. critiques the flawed jcpoa and Iran's misdeeds from the perspective of Mr. Trump and some of his associates, including National Security Advisor R.T. McMaster. The jcpoa is flawed for many reasons. The deal has a sunset clause of around 10 years for Iran to begin increasing centrifuge counts and 15 years to begin stockpiling enriched uranium. Beyond these dates, Iran will be allowed to gradually return to a normal nuclear enrichment operation on its soil. Mr. Trump wants a permanent deal and hopes to dismantle Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure. He does not trust Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's leader, despite the latter's declaration that nuclear weapons are un-Islamic. President Trump also discounts Iran's commitment in the jcpoa that it will never and under no circumstance develop or possess a nuclear bomb. The U.S. is also worried that the nuclear deal does not disarm Iran of its nuclear bomb-making potential because it does not mandate the IAEA to monitor Iran's military and other suspected sites on a regular basis. Iran has not yet ratified the IAEA's additional protocol, which allows for snap inspections. The deal also falls short of any effective control over Iran's growing missile program, and the UN Security Council's Resolution 2231, dealing with the matter, is vague and inadequate. Mr. Trump is also unhappy that the IAEA is not given a clear mandate to monitor Iran's technological modeling of bomb-making. Trump remains concerned about the IAEA's ability to fully monitor Iran. The fact that the jcpoa is not a comprehensive deal also alarms Trump. He believes that the deal should have comprised many crucial issues that stand between the U.S. and Iran, including Iran's backing of terrorism against Israel, support for Bashar Assad of Syria, interventions in Iraq, Yemen and elsewhere, and its human rights violations at home. Iran discriminates against religious and ethnic minorities and is currently holding several dual-use Iran citizens in its prisons on espionage charges. Thus, Trump insists the deal leaves Iran with a free hand, and provides it with billions of dollars to expand the operations of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC, including its Quds force across the Middle East. For Mr. Trump, who hopes to build his presidential legacy on boosting the U.S. economy, the jcpoa is of little use. The deal opens Iran's lucrative emerging market to trade and investment relations with the rest of the world, including the U.S. rivals in Europe and Asia, while its scope for expanded use Iran economic relations remains highly limited. While this objection is not publicly stated, it is implied in the administration's efforts to discourage multinational firms and large banks to transact with Iran, and to curb Iran's expanding economic ties with Europe, China and Russia. Iranian defense. The jcpoa is a win-win, and working Iran disagrees with U.S. objections and defends the deal for many of its positive attributes. The jcpoa is a win-win agreement, and has successfully resolved the long-standing nuclear disputes between Iran and its nemesis. The other issues standing between the two countries have been purposefully left outside the deal to make a resolution to the nuclear dispute simpler and faster. The jcpoa was also intended to build confidence between the two governments and thus help in a resolution of such other issues. U.S. objections now threatens to erode any trust that was built during the negotiations. Iran insists that the deal is working, and General Jim Mattis, U.S. Secretary of Defense, has also confirmed that it serves the U.S. security interest. According to periodic reports issued by the IAEA, Iran is meticulously implementing the jcpoa, and these findings have been confirmed by the U.S. intelligence and military officials. Iran says it intends to continue in this path of rigorous implementation under the intrusive monitoring of the IAEA. By accepting to voluntarily implement the additional protocol now and to ratify it in 2023, Iran will be subjecting itself to the toughest permanent monitoring and surveillance regime that the IAEA has ever undertaken in any country. Iran also notes that the monitoring of its nuclear sites is the sole responsibility of the IAEA, and that the U.S. cannot interfere in the agency's monitoring task. In Tehran's view, while the JCPOA has a sunset clause, Iran's commitment to not build or possess a bomb is permanent as per the JCPOA and the leader's determination. Even after Iran's enrichment restrictions and the intrusive monitoring system in place will continue indefinitely, making it impossible for Iran to divert its civilian program towards military use. Thus, Tehran believes U.S. concerns regarding the sunset clause of the JCPOA are misplaced and irrelevant. Tehran also insists that its foreign policy outlook views possessing nuclear weapons as being detrimental to Iran's national security. Iran has also complained that the implementation of the JCPOA has already cost it billions of dollars in dismantled centrifuges and their infrastructure, shipment of over 10 tons of enriched uranium to outside the country, dismantling of its heavy water reactor, and a significant reduction in its nuclear-related road and centrifuge building activities. For the U.S. to demand renegotiation of the deal now that Iran has sacrificed so much is unacceptable and unjust. As Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has noted, if Mr. Trump wants to renegotiate the JCPOA, he must first compensate Iran for these losses. From Tehran's perspective, the UN Resolution 2231 is independent of the JCPOA, and its wordings does not support the U.S. claim that Iran's missile testing is a violation of its spirit or intent. Iran's missile program is solely for defensive and deterrent purposes, and it is not aimed at any group or nation. Indeed, Iran's missiles are weaker than those of its main rivals in the region, and they are not designed to carry nuclear warheads, which Iran cannot build as per the JCPOA. Tehran has also said that its missile activities are non-negotiable, partially because they are not controlled by Iran's civilian leaders and fall under the authority of the IRGC. Tehran has also forcefully argued that its support for Assad regime and friendly groups in the region, including the Lebanese Hezbollah, its involvements in Iraq, and its human rights situation all predate the JCPOA, and, therefore, they were assumed to remain outside the deal. Now that the JCPOA is concluded and is being implemented, the U.S. cannot claim that the deal must be linked to these other issues. Besides, a significant part of Iran's activities in Syria and Iraq, Tehran argues, are aimed at defeating ISIS, which benefit the U.S. as well. Iran also maintains that the JCPOA is not an obstacle to American firms willing to trade with Iran or engage in investment projects in the country. The challenge comes from other U.S. sanctions. Otherwise, Tehran would have welcomed such economic relations and has issued invitations to U.S. firms to participate in Iranian tenders. If Mr. Trump wishes to expand economic relations with Iran, all he must do is to remove the U.S. sanctions. Iran's prime example is the Iran-Boeing multi-billion-dollar deal for civilian planes, which has faced tough congressional obstacles for implementation. Trump's approach applying coercive tools. President Trump has shown little inclination to listen to Iran. He appears bent on imposing all the coercive measures he can on the Islamic Republic, including sanctions, political isolation and public censure to make Tehran submit to his will. He is already disputing the findings of the IAEA concerning Iran's full implementation of the JCPOA. Washington has said that the IAEA does not have enough information regarding all of Iran's nuclear activities to make such determination. The IAEA may disagree, but some 60% of its monitoring budget is paid by the U.S. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, has already asked that the IAEA visit Iran's military sites and undeclared locations, and Mr. Yukiya Amano, Director General of the IAEA, has rejected Tehran's claim that its military sites were off-limits to inspection. Mr. Trump is also contesting Iran's missile program. He has already gained support from the UN Secretary-General, Britain, France and Germany. In a recent communiqué, these countries joined the U.S. in issuing a demand on Iran to stop testing new missiles. They have accused Iran of violating the Resolution 2231. The UN Secretary-General and Security Council have also echoed a similar concern. The U.S. and its European allies have specifically noted in their communiqué that the technologies Iran has used in a non-military space launch vehicle Samorg on the 27th of July are closely related to those of ballistic missiles development, to those of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The use of the word technologies is a new warning to Iran that it will not be allowed to advance in certain technologically advanced fields. Unless Iran is ready to make compromises on the missile front as well as in the case of its nuclear enrichment, it is expected that more sanctions will follow, and Europeans may even join or at least observe such American sanctions. The issue of missiles can prove to be a time bomb in U.S.-Iran relations and for the future of the JCPOA. While the leader Khamenei used his heroic flexibility to let Iran's nuclear enrichment infrastructure to be largely dismantled, he may not have the same flexibility with respect to the nation's missile programs. Tehran insists that its missile program is defensive and non-negotiable. Every 3 months, President Trump is required by law the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act (NARA) to certify to the U.S. Congress that Iran is in compliance with the jcpoa for the lifted nuclear-related sanctions to remain in force. The U.S. State Department has prepared a list of options for the president. All evidence to date suggests that Mr. Trump has no intention to recertify the jcpoa on October 15. If he refuses to recertify, then Congress can act to impose new sanctions on Iran. This will be a major blow to Iran, as it will jeopardize the deal, can make the nuclear-related sanctions to snap back as per the jcpoa, and discourage other nations and major companies from working with Iran as well. All these will cause serious problems for Iran's weak economy and its delicate domestic political balance. To reduce pressure from European allies on himself and to avoid being blamed for scraping the jcpoa, Trump plans to have the U.S. Congress involved in the future of the deal. A major issue which Trump wants Congress to address is the deal's sunset clause. If involved, Congress is also expected to scrutinize Iran's missiles and regional policy. For Iran, congressional involvement is nothing short of a nightmare. This is the same Congress that the Obama and Rouhani governments isolated to reach the nuclear deal. Even if Congress were to maintain the jcpoa, it would do so after crippling it through more sanctions and lengthy uncertainty and fusing debates about its future. The Trump administration, along with Congress, seem determined to impose more non-nuclear-related sanctions on Iran and to tighten the existing ones. The Obama administration initiated the post-jcpoa sanctions on Iran, and the Trump administration has already imposed a few more sanctions. The new planned non-nuclear sanctions will include sanctions on Iran for supporting Bashar Assad of Syria and radical groups like Hezbollah of Lebanon and Hamas of Palestine, testing new technologically advanced missiles, and for human rights violation in the country. The administration also plans to impose nuclear-related sanctions on Iran for violation of the jcpoa's spirit, the expectation that in post-jcpoa, Iran would stop acts contrary to American interests and those of its allies. The U.S. is already putting pressure on countries and firms to refrain from engaging in trade and investment relations with Iran. This act of the U.S. is expected to intensify and become more public as the jcpoa is further discredited and more sanctions are imposed on Iran. Many large banks and companies have remained reluctant to engage with Iran, and a few that have entered Iran are expected to pull out as U.S. pressure increases. In the past, a good number of large firms and banks have paid large penalties to the U.S. Treasury Department for busting U.S. sanctions. Indeed, the expected foreign investment after the jcpoa has not materialized for Iran, and a good part of the country's frozen oil money remains unavailable to it, accessible to Iran only through barter trades with countries holding the funds. Iran's approach: stand firm and hope for the best. Tehran's mood has been one of wait and see and hope for the best. It still expects that, by some miracle, Trump will not or cannot do what many thinks he'll do, that is, to scrap the jcpoa. Leaders in Iran believe that Trump can be isolated. For now, he has no support for scraping, or even renegotiating, the deal from other members of the 51 Group, the UN, and the IAEA. The world public opinion is also against him for his post-deal illegal maneuvering to extract more concessions. Iran also argues that the jcpoa is a unbacked multilateral deal that the U.S. must observe, as otherwise its credibility would be jeopardized. While these obstacles exist, Iran must also know that Mr. Trump is genuinely against the deal. As president, he has tremendous power, and the U.S. Congress is controlled by his Republican Party. Together, they can destroy the deal if they want. Tehran also hopes that economic interests will make other members of the 51 Group to stay with the jcpoa even if the U.S. walks out. They expect Europe to stay and assume an even more forceful support from Russia and China. Tehran is counting on its large emerging market, and is providing unprecedented incentives to lure countries and firms to engage in trade and investment with Iran. However, the response to Iran's economic outreach has not yet been very successful. Besides, while these countries have not yet supported Mr. Trump publicly, it is very possible that they change heart to protect their vast economic interests in the U.S., especially when, as expected, Trump makes the issue of missiles the source of a new major dispute with Iran. They may also be inclined to agree with the U.S. argument for the need for extending the sunset clause of the deal. Europeans can also be persuaded with a call for restricting Iran's regional deeds and human rights. In response to a possible unraveling of the nuclear agreement, Iran is also threatening to restart its nuclear program and quickly return it to the pre-POA condition. They hope this possibility will make Trump think twice before he destroys the JCPOA or acts to fully erode Iran's economic benefits from the deal. Tehran's hope in this regard may prove wishful thinking, as the U.S. has already begun sanctioning Iran for reasons other than the nuclear dispute. Washington also knows well that Iran has dismantled much of its nuclear infrastructure, and it faces serious technological hurdles to reviving its program quickly. Besides, threats will beget threats, leading to a crisis between the two nations much bigger than the dispute over the JCPOA. On missiles, Iran is arguing that other regional powers are heavily armed with even more advanced missiles, and that Iran's military expenditures are a fraction of its main regional rivals. Iran also maintains that its missiles are for deterrence. Tehran hopes that these reasons will persuade Mr. Trump and his military advisors, who better understand Iran's defensive needs, to temper their opposition to Iranian missiles. Iran also hopes to gain support for its missiles from other parties to the deal. These expectations are certainly misplaced because current U.S. military leaders despise the IRGC and its regional arm, the Quds Force, and European powers have already raised concerns about Iran's missile advances, and Mr. Trump is under heavy pressure from U.S. allies in the region to roll back Iran's missile program. The Islamic Republic has constantly bragged about its regional reach and power, including its irregular military forces in several countries, and support from the regional Islamic radical groups loyal to Tehran. The Islamic Republic has always hoped to use such show of force and propaganda to persuade Washington to work with Tehran rather than opt for confrontation. While Iran is a regional power, it is also under stress because of various ongoing conflicts in its vicinity, a fact also known to Washington. As in the past, the U.S. may even use Iran's regional power in specific conflict theaters, but it also wants to weaken the country and change its theocratic system. Thus, Tehran may not be able to dissuade Washington from scraping the JCPOA simply because it is a regional power. Tehran has been extensively using a fatwa religious edict propagated in the name of Ayatollah Khamenei to convince the world leaders that nuclear bombs are forbidden in Islam. Leaders in Tehran have hoped, and continue to hope, that the religious decree will mitigate fear and help build trust. Iran also committed in the JCPOA that it will never and under no circumstances build or possess a bomb. Tehran hopes that this commitment, along with that fatwa, will convince the 51 group, Mr. Trump in particular, that Iran's real sunset clause for bomb-making is permanent. This hope may not be all that relevant, as it was not also relevant when Mr. Obama negotiated the nuclear deal. Trump's approach will also be distrust but verify, and he is expected to insist that the current sunset clause be extended indefinitely. The way forward from delusion to reality. The arguments presented above show that both sides are somewhat delusional and tend to ignore reality for wishful thinking. Indeed, it is this mindset that has brought them to the current perilous stalemate. To emerge from this impasse, one respectable approach will be for the parties to shed their mutual misconceptions and begin to understand each other better. Only then they can move beyond their short-sighted approaches, and towards a new paradigm of rational and strategic thinking. In the following pages, I will outline some of the key truths each side might recognize as a precondition towards a fresh start. Truths the U.S. must recognize for a fresh start. The JCPOA is a multilateral deal, ratified unanimously in 2015 by the UN Security Council. The U.S. ability to exit such an agreement and then form a comprehensive coalition against Iran will be limited. Even if such a coalition were to form, it could not be sustained for a long time given the fragile political environment in the Middle East and the unstable global economic condition. Most countries will want Iran integrated into the global economy, which will require a settlement of Iran disputes. The JCPOA is a deal largely written against Iran, and outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT), according to which Iran dismantled its multi-billion-dollar nuclear infrastructure in the hopes of relief from sanctions. Making this deal even more unjust will be either inadvisable for the long-term interests of the U.S., or if done, impossible to sustain. Regimes come and go but nations endure, and they have red lines that cannot be crossed. Before the JCPOA, a section of the Iranian population mistrusted the U.S. Now, after the JCPOA, that mistrust is much more widespread. Cornering Iran by making unwarranted demands on its NPT rights can backfire. Islamic revolutionaries are against the deal, and if they have accepted the JCPOA, it is because their leader accepted it first, leaving them with no option. However, further pressure on Iran for more concessions might force the leader to withdraw support, causing the deal to collapse and spurring Iran to even consider leaving the NPT. The JCPOA's collapse can also lead to a domestic political upheaval against the moderate faction who negotiated the deal. If the deal collapses and Iran leaves the NPT, Iran will become widely radicalized, and it is possible that the country, under the leadership of a new radical junta, would move towards building a bomb. If this option is exercised by Tehran, it will be hard, if not impossible, to stop it, given that the diplomatic option has already been tested and failed. Iran can, and most likely will, become another North Korea for the US if the JCPOA is trashed and not replaced by a reasonable deal. The problem with Iran cannot be resolved through coercive diplomacy of more sanctions or military action. Sanctions would be resisted, and it is almost certain that a limited attack to destroy Iran's nuclear and/or certain military infrastructure will quickly expand into a full-scale war. Iran is a huge and complex country of rugged terrains and 80 million people, many of whom are ferociously nationalistic. Iran is a heavyweight in its region, and a self-assured Iran has the potential to become a powerful strategic ally of the US as in the past. Normal cooperative relationship with such an Iran will be in the long-term interest of the US, much more than the short-term benefits that the US might gain from animosity with the country. Thus, taking a long view of Iran and helping it gain confidence is imperative for the US. A regime change cannot happen through more military threats and sanctions. On the contrary, such pressures will make even anti-regime Iranians more sympathetic to their victimized state. Iranian culture supports the victim against the victimizer. Another corollary will be increased anti-Americanism in the country. Iranians want change, but they want it to happen internally, without foreign intervention. This desire is born from their past experience with counterproductive foreign interventions like the CIA-sponsored coup of 1953. The Islamic Republic is rapidly changing and increasingly becoming a non-revolutionary Islamic state very much akin to a more modern Saudi Arabia. Such an Iran, if the regime survives to see its transformation, can have normal relations with the US, and perhaps with Israel as well. Its Arab neighbors will also be reassured. If the JCPOA collapsed and the Iranian economy returns to its pre-POA negative plight, radicals will return to executive power and re-revolutionize the state. Truths Iran must recognize for a fresh start: the JCPOA is an executive deal, made possible and led by the executive branches of the US and Iranian governments. This legacy makes Mr. Trump king of the castle of the JCPOA. Iran's misunderstanding of this reality can increase its risks. Recognizing this fact demands that high-ranking Iranian officials cease dismissing, insulting or ridiculing Mr. Trump. Instead, they need to appreciate his concerns and find ways to close gap with him. From Trump's perspective, the JCPOA goes against the U.S. national security interests, and therefore must be modified. This recognition will require realism and foresight as well as pragmatism in Tehran. Iran must also know that the JCPOA is neither a matter of national pride nor a panacea for Iran's economic ills. It can and should be negotiated to ameliorate Trump's concerns, and Iran should not fear the result. The JCPOA is against US-Iran economic relations, and Americans will do everything in their power to prevent their rivals from having normal economic relations with Iran as in the pre-POA period. The JCPOA must change to rectify this terrible condition, which will require a more comprehensive settlement of issues between the two governments. This result may not be easily achievable, but embracing a negotiation for a global settlement of issues, particularly now that Mr. Trump is indeed asking for it, will be an important tactical move for Iran. The U.S. is capable of imposing crippling sanctions on Iran even as Iran stays with a JCPOA. Issues such as Iranian missiles, support for terrorism, and abuse of human rights can easily be used, as they are now, to impose new non-nuclear sanctions on Iran. The U.S. can also advance sanctions against any nation that might trade with Iran. Secondary sanctions. Tehran will have no recourse against such sanctions. Therefore, rejecting to renegotiate the JCPOA will not necessarily mean less sanctions or more business for Iran. It is hard to isolate Europe from the U.S. on matters relating to Iran. It is even possible that European nations will, after a short period of resistance, join the U.S. on demanding modifications to the JCPOA to accommodate U.S. concerns over the deal's sunset clause, and Iranian missiles and regional military activities. They may even support new U.S. sanctions or at the least not raise objections. Iran cannot count on the sustained support of China and Russia. They can also be persuaded to follow the U.S. as in the pre-POA period. They also have tremendous economic interest in the U.S. No amount of Iranian incentives to international firms can persuade them to transact with the country if the U.S. were to reimpose old sanctions or introduce new ones. Such an environment will only make Iran lose more and face possible future court challenges from firms that might have to pull out during their operations. Currently, Iran is in court with a few firms, which had to suspend operations due to U.S. sanctions or Iran's domestic politics. The jcpoa is based on the latent assumption that the current Islamic system will not, or should not, survive beyond the deal's sunset clause. Otherwise, why would its adversaries accept free uranium enrichment on Iranian soil after the sunset clause but not now? Indeed, Iran's insistence to preserve the jcpoa as is will only make Mr. Trump to insist on his regime change policy. President Obama used to say, war or the jcpoa. President Trump may soon say, regime change or the jcpoa. If Iran continues with its current animosity towards the U.S. and Israel, it cannot hope to expand its military capabilities beyond certain limits. In this regard, further advancement of Iran's missiles is a ticking time bomb. The same goes for normalization of Iran's uranium enrichment beyond the sunset date. There is only one condition under which Iran can become a normal state for the U.S.: normalization of relations between the two countries and a reduction of tension between Iran and Israel. Absent this comprehensive settlement, the U.S. will either dismantle the jcpoa and diminish Iran's missile program, or try to change the Iranian regime. Only a comprehensive negotiation can provide a chance for the required global settlement. Iran cannot resist renegotiating the jcpoa for a long period of time, and its fear is misplaced. Instead, Mr. Rouhani should, after coordinating with the leader, take Mr. Trump on his offer of comprehensive negotiations but insist that the new negotiations be expanded to include other matters of mutual concern, including matters beyond the jcpoa that concern Mr. Trump and Iran. Even if the negotiations reach a dead end, they can at least freeze US-Iran relations, and the jcpoa, in their current place. They will also offer Iran an opportunity to open a dialogue with the new U.S. administration. Negotiation with this U.S. administration made up of career military leaders and businessmen cannot be just diplomatic but will require a different team and strategy. Iran needs to match the Trump administration and involve its own military leaders alongside professional negotiators. Iran must also know that for Trump, facts are what people want to hear. The rational Iran will not accept closed-door negotiations with such an administration. Rather, it will insist they take place publicly. Iran must speak with one authoritative voice. Currently, Tehran is giving contradictory messages to Washington. For example, while President Rouhani has rejected renegotiations of the jcpoa, his foreign minister Dr. Javad Zarif has implied that such negotiations are possible if Iran's enriched uranium are returned. Similarly, General Hassan Farouk-Abadi, a top military advisor to Mr. Khamenei, has said that visits of the military sites may only be possible if the leader allowed. In sharp contrast, other top military leaders have insisted that Iran's armed forces will never allow the IAEA inside its military sites. Concluding remarks: accepting these provisions is a precondition for successful negotiations towards improved US-Iran relations as well as preserving the jcpoa. However, for full applicability of these stipulations, they must be admitted voluntarily and with the understanding that they will serve the respective national interests and world peace. Neither side should be threatened. Negotiating under duress of sanctions and war, just like what happened during the nuclear negotiations, is contrary to the national interests of both parties, and coercive diplomacy cannot produce lasting solutions. The author of these lines, a 30-year veteran of US-Iran relations, hopes that both sides will listen to voice of reason, and by improvising and adopting the said provisions, begin resolving issues that stand between them. Their animosity has huge costs, directly and indirectly, as billions of dollars in economic damage and many lost lives attest. Getting the parties to shed their strongly held mutual delusions is not going to be easy. Yet, it is always imaginable to change the impossible into probable, and it is this hope that must be upheld. Meanwhile, a few past breakthroughs in US-Iran relations should reinforce that hope. For example, the U.S. did extend an apology to the Iranian people for the past policy mistakes, including the 1953 Shia-sponsored coup in Iran, and the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, used his heroic flexibility to make serious concessions on Iran's nuclear program. What makes this author even more optimistic about a transformation of US-Iran thinking and reaching a global settlement is the fact that their inimical relationship has become more dangerous while the regional and global environments have become increasingly volatile. A global settlement of US-Iran disputes towards an improvement in their relationship has become an imperative. About the author. Hooshang Amirahmadi is a professor and former director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University. He holds a PhD from Cornell University and is the founder and president of the American-Iranian Council. He is also a senior associate member at Oxford University in the UK. His publications include The Political Economy of Iran Under the Qajars, Revolution and Economic Transition, and 3 other books in Persian on civil society, industrial policy, and geopolitics of energy. Dr. Amirahmadi is also editor of 10 books on Iran and the Middle East, and 16 conference proceedings on US-Iran relations, as well as numerous journal articles. A frequent contributor to international media and conferences, Dr. Amirahmadi's advice has been sought by major multinational agencies and international corporations around the world. www.amirahmadi.com. Hooshang at amirahmadi.com. Pavand News 100 1017.